And let's just give you some latest lines coming into us about Russia. The Reuters news agency is reporting that the Russian Ministry of Defense says its air defense systems were not involved in intercepting US missile attacks. We've also heard a bit more detail on Reuters that says that Russia's defense ministry said that the majority of missiles fired during the overnight attack on Syria by US, British and French forces were intercepted by Syrian government air defense systems. That's being reported by the TASS news agency. We have heard that within the past few hours as well, saying that Russia has responded angrily, as we know, to the strikes, while Syrian state media call them a flagrant violation of international law. But that sort of reiteration that state media calling those a flagrant violation of international law, and also this line just coming into us from Syrian state media saying this aggression will only lead to inflaming tensions in the world and threatens world security. That from the foreign ministry in Syria via state media. So really strong words coming in, as you would expect, reaction as this story continues to break. Let's get reaction now from Henri Barkey, who is a Cohen Professor of International Relations at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He joins me live from there now. Thanks very much for being with us here on BBC World News. What's your reaction as America is still really in the middle of the night there, but digesting this news that your administration has really led the way with these airstrikes on targeted sites in Syria?
Well, look, this was not a military strike. This was really a political strike. This was designed to send a message. It was not designed to undermine the regime, as Theresa May also mentioned. In fact, it doesn't really change much on the ground. All it does is maybe have some deterrence, create some deterrence against the use of chemical weapons again. And I think the fact that 3 countries were involved in this strike, and the fact that these are 3 NATO countries, which means that almost all of NATO is going to support this action tomorrow morning, what you will see is that it will send the message that if you do it again, this time we'll come back at you with much more greater force. Now we have much more international legitimacy. But this was important for 2 respects also. The fact that the French and the British were part of this also helped contain, if you want, President Trump's natural reaction to hit hard and hit big, because the French and the British would not have joined the operation. But Trump also knew that he could not, unlike last year, he could not do it by himself. And President Trump is under enormous pressure at home because of all the scandals. Had he gone along on his own, the strike would have had no legitimacy. People would have said he's doing this for domestic purposes. But the fact that now you had the French and the British coming along, so now you really have a serious message being delivered. But that's all it is. And you know, tomorrow morning when people wake up in Washington, there's still no Syria policy as far as the United States is concerned. You have a Pentagon policy. You had a State Department policy. We'll see what happens there. You had chaos in the White House. And so we don't know what the Syria policy of the United States is. And this strike doesn't change that. It doesn't change anything. Right? It just destroys three targets, and it sends a message to not just to the Syrians, but also to the Russians and the Iranians that says, look, you can't do everything you want in Syria. We'll see what happens next.
Well, we do have reaction in, as I just said there, from Syria saying this aggression will only lead to inflaming tensions in the world. It threatens world security. Russia has said that these strikes will not be without consequences. Is there a danger that the situation does escalate now, or do you think this is bluff and bluster?
Look, the Russians did not react about 2 months ago when about 100, maybe 200 of their mercenaries were killed by American Air Force when they tried to attack American positions and its allies' positions in eastern Syria. So I suspect in this particular case, the Russians are not going to do anything. They may try to put pressure here and there in Syria on U.S. forces in eastern Syria or U.S. allies. They may try to put more try to set to create more tension between Turkey and the United States, because those two countries are having serious problems over different issues, again on Syria. That's the kind of thing that the Russians will do, but I don't really expect any kind of a military reaction. And certainly, when it comes to President Assad and the Syrian regime saying this is not going to help world peace or world security, this is a regime that has killed almost 500,000 people, and half of its population has been displaced as a result of its actions. So I don't think it has much credibility when it makes statements like that. I think the Syrians know they can't do anything, and that's why you see reports coming from Damascus that there were celebrations in the streets of Damascus, and they will make all kinds of claims that they shot down many Tomahawk missiles, etc., that the defenses worked very well. I think that all that stuff is propaganda. They need to sell something to their own population or their own supporters. But the Syrian reaction is also going to be very muted, because in the end, you really don't want to mess with the United States, and especially mess with the United States that's led by President Trump, who may use any occasion that you give him to come back at you. So I think this is going to end exactly where it ended this evening, with 3 strikes on chemical weapons, and we'll see if the Syrians ever use it again. It doesn't. The truth is, the Syrians have been killing people without chemical weapons. And unfortunately, they will continue to do that. And this civil war, after 7 years, is nowhere near its end. And many, many more people will die. Many, many more people will be displaced. And this is what, in fact, the world has to deal with, not just the use of chemical weapons by the Syrians.
Clearly, though, as we've seen from the foreign leaders responding to this, or certainly laying out their explanations, we've heard from the British Prime Minister and from the French government, both at pains to say this isn't about regime change. They don't want to get involved in the longer-term conflict. So although this was a strike or several strikes, they are clearly limited. And as you said, in your view, it sends a serious message. But do you think the world is really at pains to say, well, this is it for now? This is our sort of hands-off approach?
I think one of the more interesting comments that came out tonight was from President Macron. He said that a red line had been crossed. Of course, this is an allusion to the famous red line that President Obama had declared and then did not implement when the Syrians used chemical weapons. I think what Macron was trying to say is, look, you crossed the red line, we hit you. You cross it again, we'll hit you again. So this is a real serious red line, and this is what he's justifying his own participation in this raid. So yes, this is a one-time act tonight, one-time strike, but it is a one-time strike provided the Syrians don't use chemical weapons again. That's what it hinges on. And if Syrians don't use chemical weapons, we will not see another such operation. But if they do, I think the next time it will be far more serious, and it will probably target the regime's important assets, more like barracks, bases, etc., where damage will be much more severe.
It's such a complicated situation, isn't it, with Iran, Hezbollah, Russia. I'm just looking now at reaction from Lebanon's Hezbollah praising the Syrian air defences and saying that the US war against Syria and resistance movements will not achieve its goals. As you said, I mean, it's so complicated. What can really be achieved short from actual regime change? The Trump administration, France, Britain going in and saying, actually, we're going to put an end to this civil war, which nobody wants to do.
Nobody wants to do because of what happened in Iraq. And remember that President Trump came into office as a serious critic of the whole Iraq operation. And he, by the way, 2 weeks ago said that he wanted all American troops out of Syria almost immediately. And the generals and the Secretary of Defense had to push back and say, look, our mission is not complete yet. We still have ISIS to deal with. So please don't make that statement again. So now there is a much more fluid timetable of a few months, half a year, etc. I suspect that's going to be extended. I don't think the Pentagon thinks it can finish the job in such a short time, and it needs to consolidate. But you see again the problem. Nobody really wants to deal with the Assad problem, because that would mean at this stage, maybe you could have done it at the beginning of the civil war, but now you have entrenched Russian presence there. And the Russian presence, by the way, is very, very extensive. I mean, they have bases, they have air defense systems, S-300s, S-400s. They have just signed a lease on a major naval base in northern Syria, I think for 49 years. So they are heavily investing in Syria. They are not about to give up on Assad. So the truth is, and if we have to be honest about this, Assad in a way has won, and it's only a matter of time until he essentially conquers every single pocket of opposition. The only interesting aspect here is that there are 2,000 American troops with the Syrian Democratic Forces in eastern Syria. They control about 20 to 25% of Syrian territory, admittedly not very populated part of Syria, but that's the only part of Syria that is not going to fall under the control of Assad and the Iranians, provided the Americans stay. And that's the decision ultimately the Trump administration will have to make. Do we give all of Syria to Assad, or do we stay there as a way of deterring, influencing the events that will come, or the negotiations for the future of Syria? Because if you allow Assad to do whatever he wants, in the end, not only he's going to completely consolidate and reimpose his dictatorial system, but he will do it with almost half of his population outside of Syria, and he doesn't want them to come back. I mean, as you said, this is an incredibly complicated problem, because it also involves millions of refugees in Turkey, in Jordan, in Iraq, Syrian refugees who want to go back, but at the moment cannot go back, either because of the civil war or because Assad doesn't want them back and has already confiscated their houses, their property, etc. So how do we deal with all this? I don't think anybody has seriously thought this through, or if they have, they realize there's no way to implement it. So this war has gone on for 7 years, and I think we may only be half the way through, or 2/3 of the way through. There's still a long ways to go, and that's a great danger, because, as I said earlier, you don't need chemical weapons to kill people, and Assad has already demonstrated that, and he will continue to do that. And Secretary of Defense Mattis said something tonight also, which was interesting. And he said, look, we need to go back to Geneva, to the peace process in Geneva. And this is exactly what the Syrians, the Russians, and the Iranians, and the Turks have essentially moved away from.
Professor, we must leave it there. Really, really good to get your thoughts, your assessment of the situation in Syria. Thank you for your analysis.